President Samia Suluhu Hassan says Tanzania is seeking at least $700 million from the IMF as it alters its borrowing strategy to take on more concessional loans and decrease the danger of a financial crisis. This is part of Samia's larger strategy to strengthen Tanzania's fiscal situation, which came after the IMF upgraded Tanzania's risk of debt distress from low to moderate in September. In recent years, the government has increased commercial borrowing to support infrastructure projects, including $1.5 billion from Standard Chartered to assist the construction of a new train. Now, increased borrowing during the pandemic, along with a drop in tourism earnings, which makes up nearly a quarter of Tanzania's GDP, resulted in an increase in the country's debt. If the discussions go well, the country will receive its first IMF policy reform assistance package in a decade. Last year, the organization dispersed $570 million to Tanzania as part of an emergency loan program to help the country recover from the coronavirus pandemic. And according to the World Bank, the country's debt increased by 20% to $37.1 billion in 2021, implying that the fiscal deficits might rise to 4.2% of the GDP this year. Today's conversation focuses on Tanzania and the IMF working towards a $700 million loan facility. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope. Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. Now joining me from Nairobi, Kenya is Dr. XN Iraki, economist and associate professor of economics and business administration at the University of Nairobi. Dr. Iraki, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are.
All right, so I want to start with a sort of snapshot of the economic situation of Tanzania at this point in time. And following 2 decades of sustained growth, the country reached an important milestone in July 2020 when it formally graduated to lower middle income country status. But we knew that, of course, that the COVID-19 pandemic came in and significantly slowed economic growth. So as of this point in time right now, what's the economic situation of Tanzania?
I think by upgrading Tanzania to a middle income, I think that was very good news because it shows that the economy of our neighbor to the south is doing much better. I know Tanzania was affected by COVID-19 like all other countries. It did not have stringent conditions like Kenya or the neighboring countries. And we had to see what was the effect of Tanzania not crossing its borders, not being stringent with COVID-19 like other countries. But the current prospect shows that the economy is recovering, the economy is doing well, and we expect it to do better in future. So Tanzanian economy has been doing better than expected.
Okay, fantastic. Now, we've seen this recent involvement with the IMF, and that's considered much of a departure from former President John Magufuli's approach to the international financial community as well as private investors. And that was a really strained relationship. Where do you think the change in approach is coming from with President Samia? And do you think that she will look to maintain this sort of Western-friendly open door that she now has with the international bilateral lenders as well as international institutions?
I think if you look at the late President John Magufuli, his relationship with lenders was not as cordial as with the current president. It was always antagonistic. But I think the current president has realized that if Tanzania has to catch up with the rest of the world, has to catch up with the neighbors, then you have to work with the lenders. You have to work with the multilateral organizations. And I think that is good because if you bring in multilateral organizations, you bring in investors, then economic growth is likely to accelerate. So I think it's good, but they must also be aware of the conditions that are given by IMF and other multilateral organizations. And I expect the current president to continue with that friendly approach to multilateral lenders like IMF and so on.
Okay, so now with this IMF and Tanzania conversation, it's a $700 million concessional loan facility. But we also know that Tanzania has also gotten commercial loans as well in the recent past. In terms of concessional versus commercial, is there a situation where one is better for a certain type of economy or one is better in the long run because of the terms and conditions and the repayment plan? What's really the difference when it comes to African economies, particularly these commercial and concessional loan conversations?
The difference goes beyond spelling. Concessional loans are always more friendly. They have lower interest rates and they usually have a longer grace period. And that is why most countries, Tanzania, Kenya, and so on, would always prefer concessional loans. They always have better terms. So that at the end of the day, the country can do more with concessional loans than the so-called market-based loans, commercial loans, that are pegged with the current interest rates. So in other words, concessional loans are always cheaper than commercial loans, and that's why they are preferred.
So these loans that we have now, particularly the conversation that Tanzania and the IMF is having, do we have some of the details in terms of the repayment period, in terms of the interest as well? There was one loan that the IMF gave Tanzania last year that they put it at a 0 interest rates. What details do we have right now as to the conversations that the two bodies are having?
I think that's a very hard question. I don't have the details of the concessional loans or the commercial loans that Tanzania was given by multilateral lenders like IMF. Sometimes that information is not public, but I think that's an area we can explore further and see how good or how suitable they are for the Tanzanian situation. So for now, I don't have the details of those loans, but we can do further research on that.
So let me follow up with that, because it's not just with you. Many people we talk to on both sides tend to say that the details are quite opaque and they're not as transparent as they would like them to be. Does that concern you? Whether it's a commercial loan or a concessional loan, does the opaque nature of many of the loans that African economies are taking, whether from the IMF or whether from China, does it concern you?
It concerns me a lot as an economist, because the loans are taken by our leaders, whether they are elected registrators or the president. Those people are elected by us so that they can represent us in economic negotiations. So whatever they negotiate on our behalf should always be public. I've raised that issue not just about Tanzania, but also in Kenya. Any loan that we get from foreign lenders, whether it is IMF, whether it is Export-Import Bank of other countries, should be public, should be transparent. The data should always be available so that as voters, we can make decisions on whether it was a good deal or not a good deal. So I'm personally very concerned when terms of a loan are not public. They should always be public.
Yeah, they should. So with this loan now, is it important? Is it an absolute necessity for Tanzania to get $700 million as a loan facility for Tanzania? What is it for? What is the importance of this loan? Does this sort of put a situation where if the country does not get this loan, we should expect this, and this to happen if they don't have access to that money?
What I know from Kenyan experience is that, in particular last year, is that anytime you get a loan from IMF, they always give conditions. Like in the Kenyan situation, we are told certain parastatals, certain state-owned organizations had to be reformed, certain tax reliefs should be done away with. So anytime IMF gives you some loans or some concessional loan, they always give you some conditions. So I expect there to be conditions in Tanzania as well.
What conditions would you be expecting?
I expect maybe some reforms in state-owned organizations. I expect some reforms in terms of taxes. Who pays taxes? Who get tax reliefs? And that's why I'm saying those details should be made public so that as economists, as observers, we can make our decisions whether those terms were good or not.
All right, so Dr. Iraki, I want you to hold on. This conversation around the loan is coming even as Tanzania's debt situation has now been raised to moderate. So we have to look at how all of that will play out in the wider context of things. And then, of course, look at how the strategy, as the president says, is changing from the previous strategy. What should Tanzania do when it comes to their strategy on addressing their debts and, of course, looking for more borrowing? So that's where the conversation will go up next, and that will come up after the break. We're looking at Tanzania and the IMF in talks for a $700 million loan facility. The conversation continues after this. My guest today is Dr. XN Iraki, economist and associate professor of economics and business administration at the University of Nairobi. The conversation is focused on the talks that Tanzania and the International Monetary Fund are having over a $700 million loan facility. Now, according to the World Bank, Tanzania's debts increased by 20% to $37.1 billion in 2021, implying that the fiscal deficits might rise to 4.2% of the GDP this year, up from 1.4% in the previous fiscal year. And that's according to a January study. So, Dr. Iraki, when we look at the country's economic situation, is this too much debt for an economy such as Tanzania to be taking on at this point too quickly, or is it just enough? Are the numbers matching up?
I think just before I came for this discussion, I quickly checked how the situation of Tanzania's debt, and I found it's about 40% of the GDP, which is much better than most of the African countries.
Yes.
Kenya and Ghana is about 70%. So if Tanzania is taking more debt under the current circumstances, I think it's not too much debt. All Tanzania needs to do is to make sure it does not reach the situation of Kenya or Ghana and put that particular debt into good use so that it improves the productive capacity of the country, because taking debt is not a problem. It is, as long as that debt is put into the right use, it makes the country more productive, it expands the economy, and improve the living standards of the current and next generation.
So these concessional loan talks are coming at a time when the IMF has also raised Tanzania's risk of debt distress from low to moderate. Do you agree with that assessment from the IMF? And I think the connection there with Dr. Iraki is just hanging, but we're getting into looking at the debt situation of Tanzania right now, with the IMF saying that it has reached a moderate level, moving up from low in September of last year. Is that something that we should be concerned about? Dr. Iraki has said the numbers surrounding Tanzania's debt right now are numbers that he's quite okay with. The country is in a much better position than many other African economies like Kenya and Ghana, like South Africa and Nigeria as well. So the debt situation seems a bit sustainable and under control. But is the assessment of Tanzania's debt risk or debt distress risk at moderate an assessment that is the fair one and the right one? The conversation also needs to look at where President Samia is saying she's going to do things differently. I do believe Dr. Iraki is back with me now. Dr. Iraki, okay, thank you so much. Great. So I was asking you about the assessment of Tanzania's debt distress situation rising from low to moderate. Do you agree with that assessment?
I think I was explaining that when I look at the debt for Tanzania, the data for Tanzania's debt is about 40% of the GDP, which is much better than Kenya or a country like Ghana. And my argument is Tanzania's debt situation is not as bad as in other countries. And I think as long as Tanzania is borrowing money to improve the productive capacity of the economy, to make sure that the infrastructure, the living standards are improved for the current and next generation, I have no problem in that.
So President Samia has said that this loan is necessary and that the country is adjusting its borrowing strategy. What do you think the difference should be in terms of how this administration goes about a new borrowing strategy versus the one that got Tanzania into a debt hole of about $37 billion as of February 2022?
I think when I look at Tanzania debt situation, I'm noticing a mixture of debts from IMF, from Export-Import Bank of India and China. So I'm seeing that the new debt strategy seems to be a mixture of debts from different sources, which I think is not a bad strategy because it is like diversified and likely to have a better effect than having debt from one source. I think there are also commercial debts from banks and so on. So I think there's not a bad strategy in my opinion.
And what can the strategy do to do better? Because what you've said is that it's not the issue of taking the debt that's the issue, but making sure that that debt is used for something that will be much more sustainable or create jobs and employment. So if this strategy was to really be fine-tuned, what would you do to fine-tune it?
I think I would make sure that any money that I borrow should never be used for recurrent expenditure, like paying wages and salaries. I should put it into improving the productive capacity of an economy. I'm talking of infrastructure. I'm talking of education. I'm talking of health, so that people have new skills and people are healthy. Healthy people, well-educated people are more productive, and that improves the economy in the long run. That is where I would put it.
Okay.
Any money that is borrowed.
All right. So if IMF and Tanzania agree the terms and conditions of this deal, this would be the first IMF policy reform assistance package that the country has gotten in a number of decades. And we've mentioned, of course, former President John Magufuli and his approach to the international community. But President Samia has been in office for a little over a year now. What do you think makes it possible for Tanzania to have these conversations and the potential of getting this $700 million loan facility with her leadership just being over a year old?
I think every president in every country has his or her new policies. So we do not expect a new Tanzanian president to have the same policies as the previous president. So I think the new president is charting her own path, and one of the ways to chart her own path is to come up with a new economic blueprint. And I think one of the mixture, or one of the ingredients in her economic bag is borrowing money so that you can improve the productive capacity of that country. Mm-hmm. So I see that as very different from her predecessor, but what we can do is to wait and see whether it is more effective.
Okay, true. And you mentioned, of course, that you're seeing a mixture of borrowing from different sources. So while the IMF talks are on, Tanzania is also discussing with the Export-Import Bank of China and India for concessional funding in infrastructural development. So this looks like a very ambitious plan in terms of what the government is aiming for and all. But is it a conversation of what should come first, taking on all these loans? Should we focus on infrastructure first? Should it be about a conversation regarding debt negotiation and concessions? Is there opportunity and space for all of it to be happening at the same time as it regards Tanzania?
I think there's nothing wrong with having all of them at the same time. You get some loans, but also improve the infrastructure. All of them are not independent, they are interdependent. Yeah. Because sometimes you borrow money to improve the infrastructure. So let's negotiate about debt, but also focus on infrastructure. Because the beauty about that is that you are borrowing money for specific purposes, so you have no time to waste, and you are likely to have better returns when you know exactly where you are putting your money in. I think the Tanzanian approach is very good.
All right. And finally now, at the beginning of March, the World Bank predicted that the country's economy will grow by 5.5% in 2022. And I know that's, looking at the state of many African economies, that's actually a good number. And it says that this is about improvement of external developments, domestic health policies, and continued support for the private sector. Looking at that growth rate, are you optimistic that Tanzania will hit 5.5% growth this year? And what do you think will drive that growth for the country?
If you look at what is happening around East Africa, look at admitting Congo into East African community. Look at what is happening in Rwanda. Rwanda is having better growth rate than Tanzania. So if we can rely on East African, what is happening in East Africa, the integration, if we can rely on African free trade area, and then you make sure that the money Tanzania is borrowing is put into the right use, I see no reason why Tanzania cannot get 5.5 growth rate or even better. So if the physical and the monetary policies are put right in Tanzania, the good thing about Tanzania is that they have been able to solve most of their political problems. They are not like Kenyans who keep on fearing that we are going to have elections this year. So given the stable political environment in Tanzania and the neighborhood, I see no reason why Tanzania cannot get 5.5 growth rate or even better.
All right. And that's some optimism that we hope will definitely turn into realism. Dr. X.N. Iraki, thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much. I also need to add that the growth rate of when Tanzania does well, we also do very well because it's our neighbor, it's our export market and import market. So whatever good happens in Tanzania, we're happy with it.
And we'll all accept it like that. Have a pleasant day, Doctor. And so there is a lot of potential that we see with things in Tanzania, and it also emphasizes how a change in leadership can lead to a change in economic situations. A lot of people have their eyes on Tanzania. There's also the oil and gas conversation happening in the country as well as around the region, and how that could bring much needed relief to the economy as well as jobs and revenue. You're watching Business Edge. Up next is NC4 to watch. And now to the stories we're keeping our eyes on. The prices of essential items, including soap, cooking gas, and cooking oil, have risen by up to a third in the past 12 months, straining household budgets at a time when average private sector pay is growing at the slowest pace since the decade before. The Kenya National Bureau of Statistics data shows that inflation rose from 5.08% in February to 5.6% in March. A report by the International Institute of Sustainable Development says South Africa's energy sector should focus on future-proof strategies to end load shedding and curb electricity price hikes, as gas is both high risk and will not be necessary in the power sector until at least 2035. The report reveals that the country's energy sector is in a disruptive phase due to rapid advances in technologies that compete with gas functions, and proposed that South Africa's short-term focus be centered on rapid addition of least-cost renewable capacity coupled with storage and increasing energy efficiency. Oil is heading for the biggest weekly loss in almost 2 years after the Biden administration ordered an unprecedented release of strategic U.S. reserves to tame rampant prices. WTI futures fluctuated near $100 a barrel on Friday after tumbling 7% in the previous session. The U.S. plans to release 1 million barrels a day for 6 months, although analysts warned any reprieve would be short-lived. The news filtered into the markets early on Thursday, just before the OPEC Plus alliance gathered to ratify a modest increase in supply for May. And finally, gold is steadying after posing the biggest quarterly advance in almost 2 years as Russia's war in Ukraine, concerns over inflation and the risk to global growth burnished its appeal as a haven asset. Spot gold was $1,939.21 an ounce after rising 5.9% in the first quarter, the most since the 3 months ending June 30th, 2020. Palladium, platinum, and silver also advanced. And that's the show we have for you today. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. Download our mobile app, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and of course, watch us on the platforms we are available. And don't forget to make it a date with me throughout the week, 11 a.m. West African time, where we put African business, the economy, and financial news and stories, as well as developments, front and center. This has been Business Edge right here on News Central. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun.